Keanu Reeves went to a restaurant, but what he did for the waitress was completely unexpected. The truth is, no one could have imagined everything that waitress was going through, let alone the impact it would have on her life. Samantha sat in the corner of the small, dimly lit diner, staring at her hands. She had just finished another grueling shift. The weight of the world pressed on her chest, and the ache in her bones was unbearable. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion from carrying plates and refilling cups for strangers, it was the emotional toll of her life that wore her down. She could still feel the sting of her ex-husband's betrayal, the harsh words he had thrown at her when she confronted him about his affair. "You're not the woman I married anymore," he had said, his voice cold and heartless. "You're weak, Samantha. I need someone strong. I need someone who can give me what I want. And you can't." His words echoed in her mind, each one a dagger to her already fragile self-esteem. She wasn't enough. She wasn't strong enough to hold onto his love, not strong enough to survive this cruel twist of fate. The cancer, the loneliness, the heartbreak, it was too much. But as she sat there, her hands trembling as she wiped down the counter, a surprising face walked into the diner. Keanu Reeves. The Keanu Reeves. Her breath caught in her throat, her heart skipped a beat. She had never met him before, but she knew exactly who he was. The actor, the one who had captured hearts across the world with his kindness and humility. He was everything Samantha thought she wanted, someone who had it all, someone who was loved by millions. And there he was, standing in front of her, smiling that warm smile. He didn't look like a movie star at all. He looked like any other man who was just passing through town, looking for a place to rest. But to Samantha, it was a moment of unexpected grace. She straightened up, wiped her hands on her apron, and moved toward his table. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice quivering, still shaken by the overwhelming emotions that had consumed her recently. Keanu smiled and nodded. "Just a coffee, please." Black. Samantha tried to hold her composure, but her hands betrayed her. She poured the coffee, her fingers trembling. Her mind wandered, and for a moment, she forgot all about her troubles, lost in the presence of this stranger who didn't know her story, didn't know her pain. She just wanted to forget for a while. To be someone else. She placed the cup on his table, and as she turned to walk away, she noticed something. A small piece of paper, folded neatly, with a few words written in ink. She didn't need to open it to know what it was. It was a check. A check for a large sum of money, more than she had ever seen in her entire life. A part of her wanted to refuse it. She didn't deserve charity. But then she thought about everything. The cancer, the betrayal, the loneliness. Everything she had endured, all the pain she had swallowed down and tried to bury beneath the surface. The tears she had cried in silence. And suddenly, that check felt like something more than just money, it felt like a lifeline. She stood there for a long time, staring at it, unable to move. And then, without warning, the tears came. She collapsed to her knees, right there in the middle of the diner, her face buried in her hands. It wasn't just the money. It was the weight of it all, the years of sacrifice, the unrelenting pain, the rejection. It was everything. For a moment, Keanu stood up, unsure of what to do. But then, he simply reached out, offering her a quiet, comforting hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to take it, but sometimes we all need a little help," he said softly. And in that moment, Samantha realized something. The world might have betrayed her, but there were still moments of kindness. Still glimmers of light in the darkness. The weight of Samantha's heart was overwhelming, a crushing reminder of the depths to which her life had spiraled. She sat there, in the corner of the diner, Keanu's check still lying in front of her like a cruel testament to everything she had lost. She could barely breathe, her chest rising and falling erratically as the tears came, tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in months, maybe years. They flowed freely now, not just for the pain she was feeling at this very moment, but for every hurt that had led her here, every betrayal, every abandonment. It all rushed back in a brutal tide. Her fingers trembled as they brushed over the check. She didn't know why it affected her so deeply. The money was, in a way, nothing more than a lifeline, a mere piece of paper. But it was everything. It symbolized something bigger than just financial relief. It was the compassion of a stranger in a world where people like her, people who were broken and beaten down, were often overlooked. She'd given so much of herself to others, and in return, she had been abandoned. Abandoned by her husband, abandoned by life, abandoned by the people who should have loved her the most. And yet, here she was, in the shadow of a tragedy she couldn't escape, receiving a kindness from someone who didn't even know her name. It didn't make sense. But, somehow, it felt right. In that moment, it was like the world had paused, everything standing still, and it was just her and that check. A sliver of hope, a chance to finally breathe again, to begin to heal. But just as quickly, her thoughts shifted. Was this kindness from Keanu truly for her benefit? Or was it another form of pity? It was a question she couldn't shake off. Pity. That word echoed in her mind. For years, she had felt that suffocating feeling of being pitied. Her husband had once gazed at her with what seemed like sympathy, even though he promised her he would never abandon her. But when her cancer diagnosis hit, and her world began to crumble, that sympathy quickly turned into contempt. She remembered the day he left her, cold and uncaring. He walked out of that hospital room, after promising to be there for her. He didn't even look back. He had found someone else. Someone who could give him what he wanted, someone who was strong and healthy. Someone who didn't have the burden of sickness weighing down her every breath. The pain of abandonment stung again, a searing reminder that she wasn't enough. That she would never be enough for him, and now, perhaps, for anyone else either. But, as her chest tightened, something inside of her shifted. She couldn't stay here forever, wallowing in her grief. She had to find a way to move forward. And that was when the door to the diner opened, and her husband walked in. It was a moment that seemed to stretch time itself. Her heart stopped, her blood went cold. There he was, John. The man who had promised to love her forever, now standing there, looking like a stranger. He didn't seem to recognize the woman he had left behind. His face was blank, unreadable, like he had forgotten everything they had shared. Samantha quickly wiped her tears away, but they kept coming, unrelenting. She felt humiliated, exposed. He must have seen the vulnerability in her eyes, for he looked at her, just for a second, and then turned away as if nothing had happened. But that brief glance made her heart shatter all over again. He didn't even care. He was a ghost of the man she had once loved, the man she had believed in. John moved toward the booth at the back of the diner, sitting down with a group of men, laughing loudly. Samantha felt her stomach churn. He had left her for a younger woman, someone who didn't come with the burdens of life. She was the forgotten wife, the sick woman who had outlived her usefulness. But then, as if on cue, John's eyes flipped back to her. His gaze lingered for a moment longer than it should have. She saw the glimmer of something in his eyes, something familiar, guilt. But it was fleeting, quickly masked by indifference. He didn't approach her. He didn't apologize. He didn't even acknowledge the pain he had caused. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in around her. She felt smaller, weaker in his presence, as if she were nothing but a shadow of the person she used to be. Every part of her wanted to scream, to run over to him and demand answers. Why? Why had he left her when she needed him most? Why had he betrayed her so completely? But as she sat there, staring at him from across the room, something changed. It wasn't a sudden realization, but more like the slow dawning of a truth she had been too afraid to face. She wasn't the same person she had been when he left. She wasn't that naive, hopeful woman anymore. She had been broken, yes, but now she could see the cracks in herself, the strength that had been buried deep beneath all the pain. She had survived, and she would continue to survive. She didn't need John. She didn't need anyone who didn't see her worth. And for the first time in a long time, Samantha realized she could love herself again. But just as quickly, the door swung open again, and in walked the one person who could destroy her newfound resolve. The other woman. She had seen her before, of course. The woman John had left her for. The one who was everything Samantha wasn't. Young, healthy, carefree. And yet, the sight of her now only deepened the wound. The woman was laughing, clinging to John's arm like she owned him, like Samantha had never existed. Samantha looked away, fighting the rising tide of anger and sorrow threatening to overwhelm her. She felt a lump form in her throat, but she wouldn't let herself cry again. She refused to. Not for John. Not for her. It was then that Keanu's voice cut through her thoughts. "Are you okay?" he asked, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. His presence was comforting, grounding her in the moment. Samantha wiped away her tears, her voice shaking as she nodded. "I'm fine," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. Keanu gave her a kind, knowing smile. "You've been through a lot, but you're still here. That's something to be proud of." Those words, simple as they were, sparked something in Samantha. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she didn't feel completely alone. She could breathe again, and that was enough. She didn't need to beg for validation from anyone, not from John, not from anyone else. She was enough. And she would prove it. Samantha stared at the check, the sharp edges of the paper cutting into her fingertips as her mind raced. Everything felt surreal. Her body trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of the choices she'd made, the life she'd built in the wake of the betrayal she'd suffered. She had given so much to John, believed in him with every fiber of her being, and yet, he had walked away without a second thought. She had always been the strong one, the dependable one, the one who kept things together when everything was falling apart. And now? Now she was left with only her memories and the remnants of a life that no longer existed. She felt the sting of tears again, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of him. She glanced up briefly, catching Keanu's gaze, his presence a calm anchor in the middle of the storm. There was something about him, something genuine in the way he looked at her, something she hadn't seen in years. He wasn't here out of pity, not like John. Keanu saw her, truly saw her, and that recognition was like a balm to her bruised soul. Still, the hurt didn't vanish. It festered beneath the surface, a gnawing ache that couldn't be soothed by simple kindness. She thought about the way John had left, how he had slipped away in the dead of night, leaving her sick and alone in a sterile hospital room, desperate for answers. His departure had been swift, cold, and heartless. She had spent so many nights wondering what had gone wrong, tracing the unraveling of their relationship, trying to find the moment when it all fell apart. But there was no clear answer. It was 1,000 little things, 1,000 small cuts, until one day, it was too much to bear. The silence in the diner was suffocating. The clatter of plates, the murmur of other diners, it all felt so distant, so irrelevant in comparison to the storm raging inside her. She had spent months telling herself that she was fine, that she could handle this, that she didn't need anyone. But sitting here, facing the reality of everything she had lost, it was clear that she had been lying to herself. She had needed him, and now he was gone. As her mind wandered, Keanu's voice broke through the fog. "Are you sure you're okay?" Samantha blinked, her throat tightening. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. How could she explain what she was feeling? The deep, insidious hurt that still gnawed at her, the sense of betrayal that she couldn't shake off? It was like a wound that refused to heal, a scar that would never fade. She took a deep breath, her fingers curling around the check in her hands. "I'm trying to be," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm just not sure I'll ever be okay again." Keanu's eyes softened, a flicker of understanding passing between them. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just sat there, watching her, letting the silence speak for itself. Samantha appreciated that. She didn't need anyone to fix her, to tell her everything would be okay. She just needed someone to listen, someone who didn't try to diminish her pain. And then, just as the weight of the moment seemed unbearable, the door to the diner opened once again. Samantha's heart skipped a beat as her gaze snapped toward the entrance. There he was. John. Her breath caught in her throat. He was standing there, looking as if nothing had changed. His eyes scanned the room, his expression blank. He didn't even notice her sitting there, tucked away in the corner, hidden in the shadows. His presence was like a dagger to her chest, twisting the old wounds open again. She watched him, every step he took a reminder of everything she had lost. He was so damn calm, so unaffected by the destruction he had caused. But then, his gaze flicked toward her. Just for a second. It was enough to make her heart stop. His eyes lingered for a moment longer than they should have, and she saw it, guilt. It was fleeting, hidden behind the mask of indifference, but it was there. John's shoulders stiffened, and for the first time since he had walked away from her, Samantha saw a crack in his armor. He was pretending. Pretending he didn't feel anything. Pretending he didn't care. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him how much he had destroyed her, how much he had hurt her, but the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't give him that satisfaction. She wasn't that woman anymore, the one who begged for his love, for his attention, for his forgiveness. As she watched him turn away, returning to his booth with the woman who had replaced her, something inside Samantha shifted. A cold, sharp edge of clarity sliced through the fog of her emotions. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about her. She had spent too long clinging to the ghost of the man she thought she loved. But he wasn't the same man anymore. He hadn't been for a long time. She was done. Done with the hurt. Done with the betrayal. She had lived in his shadow for so long, but no more. It was time to let go. Samantha felt the weight of the check in her hands again, but this time, it wasn't a symbol of pity. It was a symbol of something else, of strength, of resilience, of the possibility of something better. She could feel it now, deep within her. She wasn't broken. She wasn't defeated. She was still here. With a final, resolute breath, she stood up from the table. She didn't glance back at John, didn't spare him another thought. Instead, she turned to Keanu, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "I'm going to be okay," she said, her voice steady. Keanu smiled, a quiet understanding passing between them. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. Samantha walked out of the diner, the world outside waiting for her. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to face it head-on. No longer defined by the past, but by the woman she was becoming. She was ready for the next chapter. And this time, she would write it herself. Samantha walked out of the diner, the cold night air hitting her skin like a slap. The weight of everything that had transpired still pressed down on her chest, but there was something new now, a fire, a glimmer of defiance. She wasn't going to let herself be consumed by him anymore. She wasn't going to let him take up any more space in her heart, in her mind, in her life. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of the reverie. She pulled it out, her heart dropping when she saw the name on the screen. It was John. The number flashed at her, mocking her, reminding her of the years she had spent waiting for him to finally choose her, to finally commit to the promises he had made. She stared at the screen for a moment, the temptation to pick up overwhelming, but then she stopped herself. She had been down this road before. She had given him every part of her, and where had it gotten her? Alone. Abandoned. Betrayed. She swiped the notification away without a second thought, shoving the phone back into her pocket. She wasn't going to let him pull her back into that cycle. Not now. Not ever again. Her footsteps quickened as she walked down the street, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She tried to push the thoughts of John away, but they lingered, uninvited. She could still see his face when he looked at her that day, when he left her in that hospital room, as if she were nothing more than a burden. The pain of it was so sharp, so fresh. It felt like it had only happened yesterday. Her breath came faster, and she stopped for a moment, pressing her hands to her temples, trying to steady herself. She couldn't let herself go back there. Not now. She had come too far. But then, out of nowhere, a voice cut through her thoughts, low and steady. Samantha. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was John. He was standing right behind her, and despite all her resolve, the pain surged through her once again. Please, he said, his voice strained. Just let me explain. Samantha turned slowly, her stomach twisting as she faced him. He looked the same, distant, cold, but there was something else now, something vulnerable in his eyes. He was the same man who had abandoned her when she needed him the most, but now, standing in front of her, he seemed different. But not in the way she hoped. It wasn't the change she had longed for. It wasn't the remorse, the apology she had dreamed of. It was a desperation, a plea for her to take him back. I don't need you to explain anything, Samantha said, her voice shaking, but firm. You had your chance, John. You made your choices. I don't have to listen to your lies anymore. She could see the shock in his eyes, the hurt, as if he had never expected her to stand up for herself. But she didn't care. She wasn't that woman anymore, the one who let him trample over her heart time and time again. That woman was gone. John stepped closer, his hand outstretched, but she took a step back, holding up her hand to stop him. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. I tried, Samantha, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I really did. You have to believe me. But she shook her head, her heart hardening with every word. No. You didn't try. You left me. You chose her over me. I was dying, John. I was dying, and you chose to walk away. He winced, as if her words were a physical blow, and for a moment, Samantha saw the tiniest glimmer of regret in his eyes. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. You don't get to do this, she continued, her voice growing stronger, more confident with each word. You don't get to waltz back into my life and pretend like nothing happened. I've moved on. I'm done. John's face twisted in frustration, but then, there was a moment of silence. A stillness that seemed to hang between them, thick with the weight of all they had lost. For a split second, it almost felt like they were back in time, back when things were good, when she believed in the promises he made. But that woman was gone. She had to be. Without another word, Samantha turned on her heel and walked away. She didn't look back. But as she walked, her chest tightened. She had to admit, even to herself, that it hurt. She had spent so long building a life around him, believing that they were meant to be, that he was her soulmate. letting go of that dream was harder than she cared to admit. Her phone buzzed again. This time, she didn't even have to check to know it was him. She knew what he would say. He'd apologize, beg for her to take him back. But she couldn't fall into that trap again. She couldn't allow herself to be pulled back into his world of lies and empty promises. And then, in a moment of clarity, she realized something. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't sad. She wasn't even disappointed. She was free. The weight she had been carrying for so long, heavy, suffocating, and consuming, had finally begun to lift. She had spent so many years wondering what went wrong, blaming herself, but now she saw it clearly. It wasn't her fault. It was his. He had made the choice. He had walked away, and she had survived. For the first time in a long time, Samantha smiled. It was small, but it was real. She felt the warmth of it spread through her chest, chasing away the lingering shadows of her past. As she walked down the street, the world felt different. The night was still, the air crisp, but there was a sense of peace settling over her. She was going to be okay. Better than okay. And then, as if on cue, her phone buzzed once more. But this time, she didn't hesitate. She picked it up, smiled, and answered. "Hello?" It was Keanu. "Hey," he said, his voice warm and reassuring. "I was thinking, maybe we could grab a coffee tomorrow?" Samantha's heart fluttered in her chest, but this time, it wasn't fear. It was anticipation. It was hope. She wasn't alone anymore. And she wasn't looking back. Samantha had barely closed her phone when the night suddenly felt colder, darker. She walked faster, the rhythmic sound of her heels tapping against the pavement serving as a reminder of her heart's uncertain, racing beat. A part of her still felt a pull toward him, toward John, like a magnet that had never fully released its grip. She hated that it still affected her, but she couldn't help it. Her memories of him were so vivid, so real. Every lie, every promise, every single hope she'd placed in him. It was hard to erase them from her mind, even when she knew she had to. Keanu. That was the name that now echoed in her thoughts, the name that had become a silent promise. Just a simple coffee, just a chance to breathe in something new. He had no idea how much he had changed things in her life, just by offering that small gesture of kindness. He hadn't asked for anything in return. And that was more than she had ever gotten from John. She could hear her heart pounding in her chest as she kept walking, but the noise around her seemed to fade away. She focused only on the path ahead, the glowing streetlights casting long, soft shadows, and the cool breeze sweeping through her hair. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in so long, she felt like she was in control. The emptiness in her life felt less suffocating. She was moving forward. Samantha's thoughts were interrupted as she reached her apartment building, the familiar sight of it almost a comfort now. The weight of the past had been a constant companion, but now, it felt like she was walking through a doorway that led to something better. As she entered the building, her phone buzzed again. This time, she didn't even hesitate to glance at the screen. It wasn't John. It wasn't Keanu. It was her mother. The message was short, but the words made her stomach drop. "We need to talk. It's important." Samantha felt her heart stutter in her chest. Her mind raced, searching for what could be so urgent. Her mother had never been one to send messages like this, especially with no context. She had a sinking feeling that something was terribly wrong. She immediately dialed her mother's number, her hands shaking as the phone rang. It took what felt like an eternity for her mother to answer, but when she did, her voice was strained, unfamiliar. "Samantha," her mother said, her tone uneven. "I need you to sit down." Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She stepped into her apartment, locking the door behind her and leaning against it, listening intently. "What's wrong, Mom?" Her mother paused for a moment, and then the words came, so harsh, so cruel that they felt like a punch to the gut. "Your father, he's been cheating on me. 4 years. With someone close to us. And I just found out." Samantha's world tilted. She staggered back, as if the ground beneath her had disappeared. Her mind refused to process what she had just heard. Her father, her rock, her stable foundation, had betrayed her mother. She couldn't understand it. It didn't make sense. How could he have done this? How could he have kept such a secret from them all? Tears welled up in her eyes, but she fought them back. She had cried too many times already, for too many things. She wouldn't let him steal her tears too. "I'm sorry, honey," her mother's voice broke through, her sorrow too much to bear. "I didn't want to tell you this. I just didn't know who else to turn to." Samantha's chest tightened, and for a moment, the world seemed to close in around her. It wasn't enough that John had destroyed her, that he had broken her down. Now, her father, her own father, had shattered something even deeper inside of her. The foundation of trust she had built with both of them was crumbling right in front of her eyes. "I don't know what to do," her mother continued. "I can't even look at him right now." Samantha's mind spun, a whirlwind of emotions, anger, confusion, heartbreak. She had spent so many years building up an image of her father as this strong, dependable figure, and now that image was nothing more than a lie. A mask. Her body felt cold, as if she were standing on the edge of an abyss, looking down at all the shattered pieces of her life. Everything she had believed in, everything she had trusted, was breaking apart. But this time, it wasn't about her. It wasn't about John. It wasn't about the past. It was about her mother. Samantha closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, trying to calm the storm inside her. Her mother needed her. She couldn't crumble now. Not when her mother was the one hurting. She had to be strong. For her. "Mom," she said softly, her voice steady despite the chaos inside. "You don't have to go through this alone. I'm here. We'll figure this out together. I promise." Her mother's sobs were quiet but raw. "I just don't know how it all went wrong. How did I not see it? How did I miss the signs?" Samantha wanted to tell her mother that it wasn't her fault, that sometimes, the people we trust the most can deceive us in the worst ways. But she couldn't find the words. Not when her own world was falling apart. She didn't know what the future would hold. She didn't know how her family would recover from this betrayal, or if they ever would. But for the first time, she realized something important. She could not fix everything. She could not erase the past. She could not make the pain go away. But she could love. She could choose to love her mother, even if their world had shattered. And most importantly, she could choose herself. She could heal. The pain in her chest was still there, but it was no longer all-consuming. She had faced so much loss, so much hurt. And yet, she was still standing. She was stronger than she knew. And maybe, just maybe, she would be okay. Because healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about learning how to live with it. It was about finding a way to rebuild when everything seemed lost. And it was about choosing to keep moving forward. Samantha barely slept that night. The events of the past days had been a whirlwind of revelations, heartbreak, and sorrow, but the deep, gnawing sensation in her chest, the weight of betrayal, kept her up. The phone call with her mother echoed in her mind like a haunting refrain. It had shaken her to the core, and the more she thought about it, the harder it became to breathe. She couldn't escape the image of her father, the man she had once believed to be unshakable, betraying her mother in such a cruel and heartless way. It wasn't just about the affair, it was about the years of lies, the false sense of security they had built. Her mother's pain was palpable in Samantha's mind, her voice trembling as she tried to explain the unexplainable. How could something so destructive fester for so long without anyone noticing? It was a wound that would never truly heal, no matter how much time passed. But as the clock ticked on, something began to change inside of Samantha. She realized that, in her effort to protect herself from the hurt, she had also been protecting herself from the truth. The truth about herself, the truth about her worth. For so long, she had allowed herself to be defined by others, by John, by her father. But now, she saw that it was time to change the narrative. It was time to reclaim herself, to reclaim her power. The next day, Samantha dressed herself carefully, choosing her favorite dress, the one that made her feel like she could take on the world. She was determined to meet Keanu again, to see if the connection she had felt with him the last time was real or just a fleeting moment of distraction. But as she prepared to leave, a text message buzzed on her phone. It was from her mother. "Can you come over? I need to talk." Samantha hesitated for a moment, torn between her growing desire for personal freedom and the pull of her family's turmoil. But deep down, she knew what she had to do. Her mother was going through something monumental, something that would change her forever. Samantha couldn't turn her back on her. Not now. Not ever. She drove to her mother's house, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the past few days had been only the beginning. As she walked into her mother's home, she was immediately met with the smell of coffee, but it did little to comfort her. Her mother was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands tightly clasped around a cup, her face pale, drawn. Samantha sat down across from her, her voice soft. "What's going on, Mom?" Her mother looked up, her eyes bloodshot from crying. "I don't know what to do, Sam. I don't know how to fix this." Samantha could feel the desperation in her voice. Her mother, once so strong and sure of herself, was unraveling before her eyes. But as Samantha sat there, listening to her mother's pain, something inside her stirred. The betrayal they had both suffered, first from John, now from her father, was not something they would ever be able to erase. But they could still fight. They could still choose to move forward. Together. "Mom," Samantha said gently, "you don't have to fix this alone. You don't have to carry this weight by yourself. We'll get through this. We'll heal. But you can't let him keep hurting you." Her mother's face crumpled as fresh tears welled up in her eyes. "I don't know if I can forgive him, Sam. I don't know if I even want to." Samantha took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew how her mother felt, how hard it was to imagine forgiving the unforgivable. But she also knew that forgiveness wasn't for the other person. It was for yourself. For the peace you could never find if you let anger and resentment consume you. "You don't have to forgive him right now, Mom," Samantha said. "But you have to choose yourself. You have to choose your own healing, because if you don't, you'll always be stuck in this pain. And I don't want that for you. You deserve more than that." Her mother's gaze softened, and for a moment, it seemed like the world paused. A shared understanding passed between them, a silent vow to both begin the healing process, together. They didn't have all the answers yet, but that was okay. They would figure it out. As Samantha stood to leave, she felt a sense of peace settle over her, even in the chaos. She couldn't control what had happened. She couldn't change the past. But she could change how she moved forward. She could choose to rebuild, to not let the pain dictate her life any longer. But as she reached for the door, a thought stopped her in her tracks. Keanu. She hadn't forgotten him, not completely. She didn't know why he had been in her thoughts so much lately, why he felt like the one part of her life that had been a spark of light in the midst of all the darkness. She couldn't help but wonder if he was a sign that maybe, just maybe, there was something better waiting for her. She had been waiting so long for someone to save her, to show her her worth. But perhaps the only person who could do that was herself. Her phone buzzed again. It was Keanu. "I've been thinking about you," the message read. "Are you free later? I'd love to see you again." Samantha stared at the message, the words sinking in. It was a simple gesture, but for her, it felt monumental. She could feel the weight of everything she had been through lifting, little by little. She wasn't the same person she had been before. She wasn't the woman who had waited for John to decide her worth, or for her father's approval. She was Samantha. She was strong. And she deserved someone who would love her the way she deserved. She smiled, typing back a response. "I'd love to." As she hit send, a feeling of calm washed over her. For the first time in a long time, she didn't need anyone else's validation to feel whole. She had found her strength. She had found her power. And no one, not even the ones who had betrayed her, could take that away. Samantha felt the soft hum of anticipation vibrating in her chest as she walked out of her mother's house. The conversation had been long, filled with painful truths and quiet realizations, but she left with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if a weight had been lifted, though the scars were still there. The betrayal was still fresh, still raw, but it no longer had the power to paralyze her. She had to admit, a part of her was scared to let go, scared of the unknown. What if she was too broken? What if the pieces of her heart couldn't be put back together again? What if Keanu was just another distraction, another fleeting hope that would end up in disappointment? But the part of her that had fought so hard to survive, the part that had carried the burden of everyone else's pain for so long, was louder now. She could choose to move forward. She could choose to heal, on her own terms. The soft glow of her phone lit up, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Keanu again. She had been hesitant to respond the first time, caught in the whirlwind of her emotions, but now, she could sense something different. The text felt real, raw, like an invitation to something she had long been denied, a connection with someone who saw her, truly saw her, beyond the pain and the brokenness. She had been so used to giving pieces of herself away, to people who never truly valued her, that she forgot what it felt like to be valued for who she was, to be loved not for her need to be needed, but for the strength and beauty she had within herself. She didn't need to find herself in someone else's eyes anymore. She had to find it in her own reflection. As she opened the message, her breath caught. "I'm not asking for anything, Samantha. I just want to be here for you. I want to get to know you, the real you, beyond everything you've been through. I don't want to rush anything. Just take your time." It was the simplest message, but it stirred something inside her. She could feel the sincerity behind the words, a kindness that was rare in her life. It wasn't about pity, or desire, or filling the void. It was just about connection. It was about understanding that healing was a process, not a destination. Samantha stood in the middle of the street, the bustling world around her moving on as if nothing had changed, but in her heart, everything had shifted. She wasn't the same woman she had been when she first walked into her mother's house, terrified of losing herself. No, she had come to understand that sometimes, the only way to move forward is to let go of what doesn't serve you anymore, even if it's painful. With trembling hands, she typed back a message of her own. "I'm scared, Keanu. But I also know I can't keep running from what I deserve. I want to take a chance on this. On us." She stared at the message, her fingers hovering above the screen for a moment before hitting send. There was no turning back now. But as she let go of the phone, a small, hopeful smile tugged at the corner of her lips. She wasn't just taking a chance on Keanu, she was taking a chance on herself. The days that followed felt like a blur. Samantha threw herself into her work with newfound energy, her heart lighter than it had been in ages. She no longer lived for validation from the man who had betrayed her, nor for the approval of a father who had crushed her heart. She lived for herself now, for the woman she was becoming, strong and free, unafraid to stand tall in her own skin. Keanu respected her boundaries, never pushing her too fast, but always there when she needed him. They spent hours talking, sharing stories of their pasts, their dreams, their struggles. The more Samantha opened up to him, the more she realized how much she had hidden from the world, even from herself. She had built walls around her heart, walls that had kept out the pain but also kept out the love she so desperately needed. Slowly, Keanu began to break those walls down, one small piece at a time, without even realizing it. But there were moments when doubt crept in, when Samantha would catch herself wondering if she was making the right choice. What if she was just rushing into another relationship to fill the emptiness? What if Keanu wasn't who he seemed to be? The fear lingered, the old wounds gnawing at her. Then, one evening, Keanu invited her to dinner. It was a simple, quiet affair, nothing extravagant, but it felt different. There was a vulnerability in the air, a tension that neither of them spoke about directly, but both could feel. As they sat across from each other, the conversation flowed effortlessly, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper, something unspoken. "I know it's hard for you to trust people, Samantha," Keanu said, his voice low, almost as if he was afraid of scaring her away. "I get that. But I'm not like the others. I won't hurt you. Not like he did." Samantha's heart tightened, the mention of her father's betrayal still too fresh, too raw. But there was a truth in his words. Keanu wasn't like the others. He was patient. He didn't try to fix her, he simply accepted her for who she was, flaws and all. And in that moment, Samantha realized something profound. Healing didn't mean forgetting the past, it meant learning to live with it, to let it shape her without allowing it to control her. She could be vulnerable, she could be open, and she could choose who she allowed into her life. "I'm scared," she confessed softly. "But I'm learning. I'm learning that I deserve better. And I'm learning that I can trust again." Keanu reached across the table, his hand gentle on hers. "You're not alone anymore, Samantha. You never will be." The tears that filled her eyes weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of release, of freedom. She wasn't defined by the man who had betrayed her, by the family who had let her down. She was defined by her strength, her resilience, and her ability to love again. And for the first time in years, Samantha believed it. She believed that she was worthy of love, of happiness, of peace. And she wasn't afraid anymore. Samantha stood at the edge of the cliff, the wind whipping around her, carrying with it the scent of the ocean below. She had come here to think, to reflect on everything she had been through, everything she had endured, and everything she had fought for. The journey had been long, and it wasn't without its scars. But standing here now, on the precipice of everything she had worked so hard to rebuild, she felt something she hadn't in years: peace. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her back to reality.